It reminds me of my two mates who started a Scottish fantasy football podcast. And my God, it was a shambles. They invited me on as a guest one time, and honestly, they had no idea what they're doing. Not that I was saying you have no idea what you're doing. You clearly have a better idea than them.
You know, we get asked this a lot, Finn. A lot of people will always ask me, what's the most amazing whiskey you've ever tasted? And so often they expect me to say some 50-year-old Glenlivet, you know, bottled by a scamp from the Highlands somewhere, you know.
Yeah.
That could be true. Of course, it could be true. But I think it is. It's one of those that people always ask us those questions. And it is this dream of getting your hands on some of the rarest stock within whiskey, because the perception is, Finn, that it's so prestigious, as you know, and it's perceived to be so valuable. Now, it's so interesting because when I worked at Macallan, I was very aware of the Thomson name and its involvement with whiskey. And I guess it's just a sort of a starter. And give us a little introduction to yourself and how you've ended up working in whiskey, because it's a cool story, eh?
Yeah. So I suppose that the starting point is that I was always aware that the family had this quite, fantastic relationship with the whiskey industry. And I knew that it went back a long, long way. Certainly I was aware that my grandfather was the managing director and owner of Peter Thomson's, who were, amongst other things, a blender producing Ben Eagle's whiskey, but also a distributor of various other brands. And I kind of knew that it went beyond that as well, that there was a further family history. But, when you're a kid, you don't know so much about all the in-depth parts of that. But yeah, because of that, I've always had a fascination with the whiskey industry. I think it's always been the kind of desired career for me as well, partly because it's a hobby at the same time.
Yeah.
And I suppose there's always been something within me looking back at it being the old family business, but it no longer being the family business for the last 30 odd years. And there's been something within me that's made me think, let's get it going again. Let's kickstart it. Let's bring it back to life. And I suppose that's why I am where I am at the moment, which is trying to relaunch the family business in the form of Fin Thomson whiskey. So yeah, it's been quite the journey over the last few years, and a lot of it's been about learning more about the family history and doing a little bit more research, not just about my granddad's time, but about his granddad before him, and actually the whole 9 generations of family that we've discovered have a direct link to the industry, going all the way back to 1772, which may make us the oldest whiskey family in Scotland, potentially the world, but I'm not sure I can confidently make that claim. I'm sure there's others who might claim that themselves. But now we're obviously at the point where we're trying to launch Fin Thomson whiskey, and I suppose it's based off the back of, coming up to 10 years in the industry. I joined my local whiskey company, which at the time was called the Scottish Liqueur Centre. They morphed into Morrison & Mackay. They made Brooder whiskey liqueur as well as Carnmore single cask bottlings. Yeah. Worked for them for about 4 years, perhaps, starting off as a sales trainee and kind of morphing into a more kind of European sales role by the end of it. And then at the end of the 4 years, I ended up getting approached by Andrew Torrance, who was one of my customers when he was running the whiskey shop. And he asked me to come and work for him at Copper Dog, which was at the time a new venture, a joint venture between the independent team that was based at the Craigellachie Hotel, alongside Diageo, who were kind of backing the project. And they initially asked me to be the US brand ambassador, and sold me the dream of going out there and representing Copper Dog, doing tastings all over America, which at the time just seemed like the perfect job. I ended up not getting a visa, and I think it coincided with Trump getting into power at the same time. All of a sudden, things got a little bit tricky, and I ended up down in London instead and did the same role, but based down in London for a few years before, eventually deciding that I'd had enough of the big smoke and thought it was about time to come and do my own thing and move back up here to do that.
See, when you were a little, Finn, I mean, it's always interesting working with guys like Richard Patterson, whose family was also involved in whiskey, and you meet Mitch has met a lot of these guys up in Speyside at Glenfiddich and things who are second, third, and fourth generation. Was it growing up in bottling halls and sniffing casks as a youngster, or was it quite different to that for you?
Not quite. So my grandfather sold the whiskey company, sold Peter Thomson's in 1983-84. I was born in 91, so
yeah, Mitch was 38 at that point.
91. I think I went to a Rage Against the Machine concert in 91.
But yeah, it's gosh, yeah. So actually, I missed out on growing up directly within the industry. I've got more stories from my dad, who's got great stories of things like giving a lift to Sandy Grant Gordon. So one of the things that my granddad used to do was take industry colleagues out on these wild camping trips. He tried to reenact Bonnie Prince Charlie's escape from Culloden out to the West Coast, and he'd invite his friends who were industry legends out on those trips. And I believe the only rule was that they were only allowed to bring oats, dried oats, and a bottle of whiskey from each of their distilleries, and that's all they could survive on. Everything else they'd have to either catch or forage.
That's amazing.
Yeah, amazing stories. And I remember my dad saying that he had to give a lift to a few of them once, and he ended up picking out one of them up. It might have been Sandy Grant Gordon or John Grant. He said, "Oh, and who are you?" And the guys were like, "Well, I own Glenfarclas Distillery." So he was quickly put back in his place. But so yeah, Dad probably grew up around it more so than I did. But he was just about to start his own career at that time when the company was sold, and had to create his own path. He became a lawyer, but he's always, I think that's one of the reasons why I'm so happy that I'm doing it with him now, is that I think he's always had an inkling that he feels like he's missed out on part of this journey. So to get to do that with him now is a really nice part of it. But yeah, I suppose my early memories, I remember seeing lots of bottles of Ben Eagles around the house. You might recognize some of them. Ben Eagles was famous for having the ceramic series. They had the Birds of Prey, they had the chess sets, and I remember seeing a lot of them as a kid. I remember knocking one over and breaking one once and getting a bit of trouble about that.
It's only worth $150,000 now, Finn. Don't worry.
Yeah, exactly. It's maybe increased the value of them. There's one less out there. So
yeah.
And I suppose my first real taste of getting directly into the industry was when my grandfather kind of let the rest of the family know that not when he sold the company, he decided to keep hold of the casks that would have gone towards the Ben Eagles blend. And that's the reason why we've got such an amazing collection of old whiskey. My grandfather's an avid collector, and he loves holding on to things, and he's done the same with a lot of the casks of whiskey that he could well have sold back in the day. And I remember being a late teenager and getting taken up to Glenfarclas, where some of the casks are stored, and going up to meet John and George, and we had a tasting of, gosh, must have been about 20, 30 different samples that we had put in front of us, and it was a lot of kind of nosing of them. And then we had dinner with the family, and that was all quite a surreal experience. As a late teenager, you don't really understand what's going on at that time, but it's a nice little taste to say, there's something amazing about this industry, and there's something quite special about it. And I suppose from that time, it was just a case of slowly having more of these little experiences to kind of push me towards going into the industry properly.
Yeah.
Very cool. And so let's talk about these casks that you've got. I mean, you've obviously you've just released some very old whiskies, a 50-year-old, 30, is it 31 or 32? You've got
we've got the 50-year-old Glenlivet. We've also got a 34-year-old Dufton. So distilled in 1987, a 32-year-old Auchentoshan, 89, and we've also got a 34-year-old North British, 88 as well. So those are the kind of the big four old ones that we're launching with.
Yeah,
and when
I'm
you
really
guys
looking forward. Sorry, Mitch, I'm going to cut you off because I've got samples and you don't.
What the fuck? There's a script and you've got samples?
Dad, you promised me you'd share it.
You know,
Yeah.
you know what?
I said to you, Finn, it's not happening.
It would be because of the terrible present I also gave to you when we met up to hand the samples over.
Wait to hear this, right? Wait to hear this. This is brilliant. So I met Finn to pick up the samples the other day and bumped into him outside the Johnny Walker Princess Street as planned. 3:30 on the button. Finn, great to see you. High fives, little cuddle. And somehow I ended up with seagull shit all over my hand, right? And I'm looking at my hands going, how have I got bird shit all over me? And I'm looking at his hands and there's none on him whatsoever. And what had happened was a bird had crapped all over his shoulder. And
not quite all over. It was a wee dollop.
Well, most of it ended up on my hand. It was
brilliant. There's only one thing I don't believe about that story, and the fact that you were on time, Daz.
It wasn't. He says it was 3:30 they were meant to be. It was 3 o'clock, and it ended up being about 3:30.
Yeah, 3:38.
Story of my life, mate. See
these older whiskies, then, Finn. When you're selecting casks, I know you've got a good inventory there. What's the process for you? Are you going yourself? Have you got someone there behind you also sort of giving you a few nudges, going that cask is exactly what it should be, or that one needs another couple of years perhaps? Because is it quite fragile at this stage of their life, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, we've got dozens of these old casks and they require obviously quite careful management. I've been keeping an eye on them quite closely since starting officially doing you know, the family business. Been taking regular samples and just trying to keep an eye on them and getting them a little bit better managed. And you know, it's absolutely the case that not all of them are going to be right for bottling. It, you know, we have to have a degree of honesty about it all, and not everything's going to be fantastic drinking just because it's old and rare. And I suppose there's got to be a little bit of honesty about that, because so many people will tell you or try and sell a whiskey based on its age and based on its rarity that it's worth a certain amount just because of that. But in reality, it's not the case. And as you said, these things can be incredibly fragile. They can go over the edge very, very quickly, become too woody. They can lose ABV, they can leak, you know, all sorts of things can happen. And I suppose that's been one of the major jobs in the last 5 years, is getting right on top of that and understanding the stock that we have. So when we were, you know, thinking about the first set of bottlings that we're doing, we wanted to launch with some old ones that were going to make a bit of noise, obviously, and I think the Glenlivet 1970 obviously does that. It's already bottled. We bottled it last year actually because it had turned 50. I'd been keeping an eye on it very, very carefully from about 46 onwards and taking regular samples, and I think we've hit the absolute sweet spot with it being 50. When you do taste it, it's still got that freshness. It's still got that kind of liveliness that you'd hope from a slightly younger whiskey. But the wood's giving it nice kind of tobacco notes, nice licorice notes. I do think it's the kind of whiskey where if you left it too long, it would become too woody. It would become too bitter. And for that reason, we didn't want it to hit 55, 60. The ABV on it was still fantastic. It's about 50% alcohol still. The volume of it was decent as well. So you could have left it in the cask for much, much longer, but from a tasting point of view, it was very much ready for bottling. But yeah, when we're trying to choose all the casks, I suppose I'm trying to base it on more than just taste. I think one of the things I want to achieve with the bottlings, and it's partly because it's my name that's going on the bottle, is to give each cask a little bit more of a personal story to it all. To try and get across that there's a reason for bottling things beyond purely just taste and the fact that it's a certain age and a certain distillery. And it's something I'm going to do within the packaging. I'm going to put a story of each cask on the kind of back label of each bottle, which will explain, I suppose, my kind of personal relationship with each cask and how it is that I've come to choose that one. The North British, as an example, which I think you've got in front of you here.
I do put it in front of me here. I do. Yes, I do.
Sorry,
and it's fabulously. Yeah.
We'll talk you through it, Mitch.
Yeah, tell me about it, Mitch. Tell you all about it.
For me, it's a cask that's got a really good connection to the family story. It's not so. North British was actually the key component of the Ben Eagles blend from a grain point of view, and therefore from a general point of view, made up the backbone of Ben Eagles. So there's a really good family connection there. And actually, my grandfather was one of the kind of shareholders of North British up until he kind of left the industry. So it's got good connections to the family. My personal connection to, when you talk about early whiskey memories, North British is probably actually my first whiskey memory, although I didn't know it at the time. So I'm a big Hearts fan and I like my rugby. So early kind of childhood memories of sport would often be going to Tynecastle Stadium or Murrayfield. And when you're a kid and you're walking along that direction, you get this amazing smell and you're not quite sure what it is other than something very, very boozy. But it turns out that it is actually North British, and it's that kind of like malty smell from the distillery. So for me, this whiskey was important to include in the first set of releases because it's got that personal attachment to me. It reminds me of kind of childhood trips to go and watch Hearts get beat and go and watch Scotland get beat. But yeah, and it's a fantastic whiskey as well. And I suppose that's what I'm trying to get across with all the releases that I'll do. They'll have some kind of storytelling element, which is a personal connection to me, which I think is important when your name is on the bottle.
Yeah, I think it's really important when we talk about rare and aged whiskies. I think the story is so important, and we're always digging around for that. Why that cask? Why was that one left? What was it that the decision making process? Who was involved? Always so interested. And it's funny actually because we did some work on old grains over at White Mackay, and we had Invergordon, of course, but we also had some nice casks of Port Dundas as well. And Mitch has been doing some work recently. He's got some lovely old Girvins, actually first drops to run off that distillery, which is really, really cool. And I'm always interested to try old grains. It's something that we don't always get a chance to do, right? And my first memories of Cameron Bridge, actually, I grew up in Fife, and I remember just watching the lights twinkling away and just thinking, oh, what's that? I thought it was a spaceship. My mum turns around and tells me it was a distillery. So it's not dissimilar to yours, Finn. It's just these little memories, isn't it? Little snippets of time. But this whiskey is actually lovely. It's got a lovely fennel, almost sort of slightly aromatic, kind of soft, fresh spiciness to it. It's really nice.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it was old grain. When you get into this age, obviously you're getting these lovely sweet notes a lot of the time, and often it's moving into almost a more kind of like aged rum kind of characteristic. For me, I get definite elements of like salted caramel and a little bit of toffee, but you can also see it going a little bit tropical as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, easy drinking whiskey. Strength in it's still really, really high. I think it's still coming in about 50, 58, 58.5. So still quite a chunky whiskey, but actually easy drinking, sweet, smooth. And as you said, it's actually quite complex for an old grain whiskey. There's lots going on with it as well.
Yeah.
But it's quite interesting. We've got about 10 casks of this old vintage of North British, the 1988s that we've got, and they're all slightly different. It's amazing how they do just go slightly different paths. And I suppose grain sometimes maybe takes slightly longer than the single malt cask that we have to find that kind of separate path. But it will be interesting to see when we bottle the next sister cask of this whiskey, how different it is. And that will all be part of the storytelling and hopefully part of what people can buy into going forwards. If they've bought a bottle of this, then in 2 years' time when we bottle the next kind of cask next to it, then hopefully people want to come on that journey.
Yeah.
And
when you're just on that note, Finn, when you're talking about the future bottlings, are you guys going to continue around about this age statement? Do you have those kind of stocks?
Yeah, we'll always do a combination, and that's a big part of the business going forwards. We can't rely on only bottling old whiskey. So within the first set of releases, we're also doing what we're kind of calling the core range, which is stock that I've got hold of in the last few years, and typically that will be between, I don't know, 6 and 16 years old. So that's probably more my contribution towards the family portfolio stock, things that I've picked up over the years, and maybe a little bit more experimental as well, trying some interesting re-racks. But again, coming back to this kind of key point, which is doing things with meaning and doing things with a bit of story behind it as well. So I think the best example of which, within the first releases anyway, we've got a 13-year-old Inchgower that we're releasing. So I re-racked it into a Torres red wine cask back in, I think, September 2020. And the reason for it being Torres was that, well, number one, my grandfather imported Torres back in the 70s and 80s. So it was one of the wineries that he was the selling agent for within Scotland. So we had a really good family connection there. So much so that when I turned 18, I was sent packing out to Penedès, which is where their kind of tourist center is. And I did a summer out there doing wine tastings and tours. And had a great summer, having a lot of fun and drinking a lot of wine, but ultimately making a little relationship with those guys out there as well. I remember Miguel Torres, who was the owner of the company, pulling me in on the last day, and I remember him saying, if you ever do anything with wine, get in touch. Obviously I know that you're involved in whiskey, so if you ever do anything with whiskey going forwards, please get in touch, and we're always here to help. And I remembered that coming, as we were beginning this project, and picked up the phone to them, gave them a little reminder of who I was, and they were more than happy to help with sending out some Torres red wine casks. And I thought, well, if you're going to re-rack something into red wine, as a lot of people are, why not try and do it with a little bit of story? So there's some kind of meaning behind it. It's not just any old red wine cask that you've picked up from a cooperage. It's actually something that's a little bit more considered. And I think that's the strategy going forward. It's trying to play on elements of the family story, or my own personal story that's still to come, and trying to put that into the bottlings that we do.
Brilliant. Let's chat about this last whiskey that you kindly gave us, which is it the Dufftown, did you say?
It is, yeah.
Daz, did you say gave us there?
Yeah, us. Yeah. You will get yours. We'll get yours. Yeah.
Are you going to keep some back?
Nah.
They're not. To be fair, they're not big samples, so I'm sure you'll polish them off. The Duffton's really interesting, and again, like many things that independent bottlers do get their hands on, you don't. Well, I suppose you do see it as Singleton, don't you? But it's probably one of these kind of distilleries that goes under the radar a little bit, and in all honesty, it wasn't a distillery I knew masses about when I was first kind of looking into the stocks that we had. And it wasn't until we lined it up for bottling, and somewhat based on the flavour of it, because I think it's a cracking dram, but I wanted to find out a little bit more about the distillery, and got in touch with a few of the guys from Diageo. Irv was incredibly helpful. Stuart Morrison as well, who's one of the blenders there. We're both able to give some real good nuggets of information about the distillery, which make it just a little bit more interesting than some of the other kind of old whiskies that we had in the stock. And essentially what Irv has been telling me is that there was a change in distillery style back in the 90s. So this is 1987, and would have been one of the last casks or last casks filled with the old distillery style. And they changed the style to try and make it, I believe, a little bit more kind of more grassy and move away from a kind of nutty character. I believe, and I'm not sure if I'm meant to be sharing all this, but the blender's term for the old style of Duffton was called cake mix.
Yeah.
Now, not a term that I'd heard before, and quite an interesting one. I've never heard any other kind of distillery character described as that, but you can kind of get elements of that when you're tasting it, it's still a little bit biscuity, but it's got a lovely kind of sweet element to it again. People have picked out all sorts of wacky tasting notes with it. It's got bitter chocolate, it's going tropical fruits again. So a super complex whiskey, but I suppose what's really interesting about it to me is that it's a style of whiskey that doesn't exist anymore. Yeah. And when you're talking about old whiskies and the appeal of old whiskies and that whole rarity element, this plays exactly into that, because you're tasting a whiskey that quite simply won't be produced again. That style of whiskey from Dufton just will never exist. So to be able to bottle it, and to be able to bottle it at such a good age is quite appealing.
It's really nutty. It's like pistachios. You know, you've got that like saltiness, that bitterness, but it's a pleasant bitterness. You do have the cake mix with the sweetness and the creaminess and all the butters and all of that. But it's a really unusual flavor profile. It really is. And it really hangs around on the palate, Finn. It lasts a long time. It's not a heavy, big whiskey, but it does linger on. And I guess that cask, I'll be interested to know, because I don't know the strength of it, but I guess that's held on to its strength fairly well, that cask, yeah.
Yeah, it's 54.7.
Yeah, nice.
So, you know, it's still pretty chunky, and yeah, again, could have left it for a bit longer, but the thing that made me want to bottle it was that slight kind of bitter chocolate note that I know that sometimes if you let that develop too much, then it can maybe just go over the edge. And I don't think it's anywhere near that at this point in time. But, you know, it's ready for bottling. And again, we're lucky enough to have 2 sister casks for this whiskey as well. So we'll get to see how they develop and maybe let them get a little bit older and see where they go.
Mate, it's so cool to hear about these whiskies. And what a brilliant inventory of rare and aged stock you've got, and being able to look after that. There must be a bit of pressure on your shoulders, Finn, because you've not only got the whiskey to look after, you've got the family name to look after as well.
Yeah, you know, it's a very good point, and I suppose a lot of people would look at it as pressure, and there is an element of it. But one thing I'm incredibly fortunate about is the fact that all the family's been so supportive. You know, the direct family with mum, dad, and my sister are right behind me doing it, but also my granddad as well. And you know, I think he's certainly happy to see me trying to bring the family company back to life. So I think there's an element of pride there, and you know, that's part of the reason of why we're doing it as well. I think, you know, ultimately, I recognize how fortunate I am to receive a gift like this, and not many people get this kind of opportunity. And there's definitely been points in the whole journey where you think, do you know what, you could go and sell all the casks. You could wipe your hands with it. You could sail off into the sunset on a little yacht, having sold some expensive whiskies, and you know, finish the story there. But when you've received a gift, instead of, you know, of getting it any other way, I feel like there's got to be an attitude of repaying that somehow. And I'd like to think that what I'm doing through kind of retelling the family story and bringing it back to life is something that my granddad is going to be quite proud about. And certainly from what I've shown him so far, he seems right on board with it. So, you know, it'll be a really nice moment as soon as we've got that first whiskey officially bottled. He's the first person to get one, and yeah, have a little dram with him.
Nice. Cool. Well, I've got 2 bags of porridge downstairs. You bring a bottle of 50-year-old Glenlivet, Finn. I'll bring a couple of bottles of Cameron Brigg, and we'll get on with it.
Don't joke about it, because that's one of the things we're going to be doing. I want to recreate some of these epic journeys, and the one thing my granddad always tells me about them is that people only ever did them once. There were no repeat attendees. Is that right? Is it? I think it's one of these ones that can look really good on paper, but the realities of storming through, you know, muddy Scotland with midges everywhere and no food and sleeping. They didn't even bring tents. So, you know, they slept wild. So you might need more than 1 bottle of whiskey to make an enjoyable experience.
Brilliant.
And Finn, just for anyone listening that may have not have heard of Fin Thomson whiskey, where can they find it? What's the website? What's all that kind of good stuff?
Yeah, the website is www.finthomson.com, which we're very lucky to have managed to steal. But yeah, stock will be going live. We're launching in the UK, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Italy as some initial markets. In the UK, I'm trying to work with a number of really good retailers. I think it's always good to support all the guys that talk so passionately about all the different whiskey brands around. So guys like Aberdeen Whiskey Shop, Greenwelly Stop, Woodwinters, Villeneuve Wines, Omen Whiskey Shop. All these guys will have stock in, and there'll be a few online shops as well. We're not selling any direct from our website. We want to kind of push people in the direction of retailers. So follow us on Instagram as well, which I think is just Fin Thomson Whiskey, and we'll do lots of posts about where you can pick up some bottles.
Well done, mate. Congratulations, and we look forward to more from you. Yeah.
Thank you very much, guys. I appreciate the time.